As part of our ongoing Thinkers segment, we look at the emerging economies. In their latest book, Rising Tide, Professor Robert Lawrence and Associate Professor Lawrence Edwards explore the unique challenges and opportunities that come with the global economic growth. And I asked them if the growth of emerging economies is good for the United States.
Let me say overwhelmingly the answer is yes. It's not easy. It presents challenges. In particular, when we look at some of the labor market effects. Clearly, for Americans, competing with imports from low-wage economies has presented difficulties. Some of them have lost their jobs. Some of them have seen their wages being squeezed. But by and large, for most people in America, that trade has meant higher living standards and a lot of opportunities to export to the rest of the world.
Were there any surprises to you during the writing of this book? What was the greatest surprise?
I think there were many surprises. I think, firstly, the relationships are much more complex than we'd thought about. One of the challenges is obviously to distill the key aspects of the relationships that we thought were important. I think one of the key insights we found was that the changing employment patterns in the US, particularly the changing share of manufacturing in employment, is part of a much bigger structural relationship that is not unique to America. This is a global phenomenon amongst developed economies. And that raises very hard questions about the role of China and other emerging economies in driving the share of manufacturing and employment downwards.
And one of the charts that I have from you guys shows a change in employment with respect to manufacturing. The United States is on here. Over the past couple of decades, we've lost 14% in terms of the average rate of change of losses of jobs. But what's interesting here isn't just necessarily the numbers, it's the fact which countries are here. So when Americans go to the polls and we have these big debates such as the one we just went through in a presidential debate, and we say, so-and-so's taking jobs away from Americans, it's not just America that has lost manufacturing jobs. The entire world as a whole has lost manufacturing jobs. And I know you've done some research, but why is that? What's really happening here?
Basically, there are three things that are working. Number one, automation. We have seen very rapid productivity growth in manufacturing.
So one person is building more items.
One person can make things it used to take 2 or 3 workers to make. So we don't need as many workers. The second thing is, some of the jobs, in fact, are now being filled by workers in emerging economies. But the big deal is that when goods have become cheaper, and everybody knows what's happened to the price of computers, for instance, people don't go out and buy that much more goods. What they do is they take the money they've saved and they tend to buy services.
One of the criticisms that economists usually remark when you talk about developed countries and developing countries is the wage issue, right? There's a wage discrepancy there. In your studies, did you find the wage in America or in Europe for manufacturing, did it increase noticeably? And what was the relation to that of developing countries, for example, in China?
Well, this wasn't really a key focus of our book. But what we do find is that Chinese growth, emerging economy growth, and the exports of emerging goods from emerging economy has been good for real wages in the United States. There are concerns about driving competition from emerging economies causing wage inequality in the United States. We don't find strong evidence for that occurring now. Effectively, the cheaper goods from China makes US citizens and US consumers richer in terms of what they can purchase.
We estimated that on average, Americans have their income raised by $500 a person as a result of their trade with emerging economies, because their money goes further.
Because they have better buying power.
Better buying power and more choice.
What about the next decade, the next 10 years? Because China is also asking themselves the same question as well, as with all countries, is how do we get more productivity? How do we have a better quality of life without having inflation? And it seems to be the impossible scenario, but where do you see those trends headed towards in the next decade?
By and large, the jobs of the future are not going to come in manufacturing. Basically, already 90% of Americans are not working there, and that trend is most likely to continue.
Is manufacturing important anymore in the developed world, in Western Europe and the United States?
I mean, manufacturing is obviously an important sector. It drives a lot of the productivity growth. This is an important implication for wages. It is shrinking, which leads to the bizarre outcome that it looks like developed economies are becoming less globalized because they're less exposed and workers are less exposed to manufacturing trade, which is quite an interesting outcome in itself. But I think manufacturing will remain. It will be part of the economy. It's not going to be as big as it used to be, but it's not going to disappear.